Hello everybody, in this episode I'm going to show you how to export out a project from Premiere Pro. There are a couple ways of doing this, and one is through the software called Media Encoder. You can send projects to Media Encoder or you can export directly out of Premiere. Now if you have a system fast enough, you'll be able to send projects to Premiere, you'll be able to send projects to Media Encoder, and Media Encoder will take care of the compression for you while you can still go back into Premiere and edit a different project. But if you're done with Premiere and you just want to do a quick export, Premiere is usually the way you want to go. Media Encoder is really good for batch export. I'm going to show kind of both processes here. They're both very similar. It's just if you export directly out of Premiere, it will tie up the software and you won't be able to use Premiere while the export is taking place. But with Media Encoder, you'll still be able to use Premiere. However, you won't with Media. If you send it to Media Encoder, you will still be able to use Premiere. However, with Media Encoder, sometimes depending on your system that you're working in, it will make work in Premiere very laggy because it's taking up a lot of memory and processor speed while it's doing that. So let's get started. We've got a project here in this timeline. First of all, you're going to choose the timeline that you want to export. I've got this timeline here that I'm going to be exporting out to a project. And I want to show you the settings from the timeline here. This is important for when it comes to exporting out. Here I've got a timeline called Final Edit Sound Mix. Down here I see that icon in my project area that says Final Edit Sound Mix. This timeline here is this timeline right here. If I close that, in fact, you can double click on this one and there it is right there. It shows up. So this icon here represents this timeline here. So what I want you to notice is that as I select this timeline down here, look up at the settings right here. If this is not showing, you can go up to your little menu bar here, click on this, and tell it to show your preview area. Right now, so this is showing my preview area here. And look at the settings on this. This is in essence, what's called a 4K HD timeline. The aspect ratio is nearly 4K. It's not quite 4K, but sometimes you'll hear them refer to this as 4K HD, which is a little bit less than 4K. It's 3,840 pixels by 2160, and my frame rate is 23.976. This is 24 frames per second drop frame, and the duration is about 1 minute 50 seconds and 15 frames. It's kind of important to know at least your frame rate and your resolution here and your pixel aspect ratio. Three major things here is your resolution, your pixel aspect ratio, and your frame rate. And also with audio compression, it's important to know that you're at 48,000 hertz here, stereo file as well. So we kind of know what we're going to be doing when we're exporting this. Now one really important thing to notice also with this 380/40 by 2160, if you want to figure out your aspect ratio there, I'm going to bring up on my calculator and I'm going to go 3840 divided by 2160 will give your aspect ratio as 1.78 essentially to 1. So for every 1.87 pixels you have going across your screen, you have 1 pixel down. What this ends up being in numbers that you've oftentimes heard is 1.78 to 1 ends up being 16:9 aspect ratio, which is the aspect ratio that you have on most high-definition television screens and most computer screens. I shouldn't say most computer screens. Some are a little bit wider, but most standard computer screens and televisions will be at 16:9. In fact, YouTube displays in 16:9. If your project is wider than 16:9, like a 2 to 1 or a 1.85 to 1, then it will end up being letterbox. You'll see letterboxes on the bottom and on the top to compensate for the 16:9 aspect ratio. Well, let's export here. You can go up to File, Export, and Export Media. A shortcut for this is just hitting Command or on a PC Control, Command M, and it will bring up M as in master. I like to think of it as master. It's actually media because you're mastering your project. And it will open up this screen here. A couple things you want to look at here is you want to first of all make sure that your export video and export audio is checkmarked. If you've been exporting audio, it might just have that exported. If you've just been exporting video clips, it might just have that one checkmarked. Make sure they're both checkmarked. Up here, you've got a couple things at the top. You can checkmark Match Sequence Settings, and what this will do is it will export this out. What Premiere uses as a native playback engine is a codec called MPEG Preview. It's a format, or what we call a codec, a compressor, decompressor, or writing language, basically, telling it how to interpret the video. Codecs are basically different video languages or audio languages that the computer can learn by installing different codecs. And different editing software can learn as well. Basically, Premiere, when it's displaying it on your screen, it is converting anything that you use, whether you're using DSLR footage, Alexa footage, Red footage, Blackmagic footage, ProRes, any of those different codecs you're playing back, it is converting it to what's called MPEG Preview, and it's doing that real time. And Premiere converts it on the fly to that codec right there, to MPEG Preview. And it does that because it's a quick, efficient codec, and that allows you to edit real time with footage like RED or raw footage like Canon raw footage or Alexa raw footage. It's very helpful. Very rarely will you checkmark this and tell it to export in MPEG preview. I would recommend not doing that because it does take it down. If you're using RED footage or something else, it will take it down to about 50 megabits per second. We'll talk about compression here in a minute and talk about it. But right here you'll notice the quality is at 50. The output, it exports it out at 50 megabits per second, which is pretty decent quality, but which is lossy quality when you're exporting out something like RED or something that uses more than 50 megabits per second. You're going to lose quality. Now the idea with compression is to get your file size down as small as possible while maintaining visual and audio quality. So a good codec for that is going to be, let's uncheck this, is going to be H.264. H.264 is a pretty standard codec for the industry right now on almost anything that you're using, at least as far as a viewing codec. H.264 is really great for a viewing codec. It takes out the information that it doesn't need, like color information. If an image is displaying mainly like a blue sky, it'll take out the red and greens and take the size of your file down. So H.264 is a good compression, has a good compression algorithm. But down here what we're going to do, so this is the general format, and down here you have different settings. As we scroll down here, you'll notice a whole bunch of different settings you can do for iPads, for iPhones, different types of settings depending on where you're going. If you're going to YouTube, you can go down to the bottom here and you'll notice there's YouTube settings down here. We are working with 4K footage, and YouTube will display 4K footage now. But if you want to do YouTube 1080, which is pretty standard, then you're going to select YouTube 1080p HD. And this is pretty standard for YouTube. I'm going to grab my little playhead here and move it into my video footage. This is kind of going to show what your footage looks like that it's going to be compressing. Down here under summary, it will show the settings that you've selected. So far, this is taking your footage down to 1920 by 1080. Keep in mind if we had an aspect ratio like a 2:1 aspect ratio or 1.85 aspect ratio, more of a cinematic aspect ratio, and we were encoding to 16 by 9, it would add letterboxes on the top and on the bottom to compensate for that space, to create the 16 by 9 space without stretching it and making it look weird. Because keep in mind 1.85 to 1 or 2:1 is going to be a wider aspect ratio than 16 by 9. And the reason why it has not added any letterboxes over here is because if you go to the output, notice 3840 by 2160 has, if you divide it, 3840 by 2160 will end up to be 1.78 to 1, and 1920 by 1080 is also the same aspect ratio, it is 1.78 to 1. So you have the same aspect ratio, so it's basically just proportionally shrinking this image to fit into the same aspect ratio. So here it shows your output, your new settings that you're exporting out to, and down here it is showing your source, which are your source settings. So your original settings and what it's going to compress to. If we move down to the video window here, first of all, these tabs down here, the effects window is kind of a waste of time in my opinion, because you're going to do all the effects within Premiere. You're not going to change it while you're compressing it. You want it to look like you had it inside of Premiere. I shouldn't say it's a waste of time, but it's not a lot of people use that. As we move over to the video tab, you have a couple things here. First of all, you have this match source button right here, and keep in mind everything down here, anything you check mark, it's going to match the source settings for that item right there. So moving on down the line here, we've got resolution. Notice it is unchecked. We set the YouTube settings, so it's set up for 1920 by 1080. If we hit match source, notice when it check marks it, it sets it at 3840 by 2160, the original source. And notice it has check marked everything down the line for us here. So everything is matching the source settings. The one item that you'll be able to change is at the bottom is the bitrate encoding rate, the target bitrate, which is going to take out, with this footage here, this is RED footage, is around 150 megabits per second, and the target bitrate is 16 megabits per second. So this is going to be quite a bit of compression, but it will go through and figure out what it needs to take out to make this compression, to make this image look as good as possible for the file size that we have. And look at the estimated file size down here. It's estimating that this will end up being about 215 megabytes. About a quarter of a gig, which is going to be which is going to be fairly small. So this has gotten the size way down. If you're running this at 150 megabits per second for 1 minute and 50 seconds on red code, this would be probably anywhere between 1.5 gigs to 2 gigs. So this is taking out quite a bit of information here. But like I said, we're going to do this for YouTube, so I'm going to pull down. This just changes to custom because I went down and did some custom settings. I'm going to take this down to YouTube, start with my YouTube settings, go YouTube 1080 HD, move down here. So I'm going to leave my resolution at exactly at 1920 by 1080. Move down to the frame rate. That's check marked because we are matching frame rate. We don't want to change that unless you're sending this to broadcast or something and you need to get it at 30 frames per second drop frame. Progressive, scan. It's okay that's checkmarked or not. Right now it's progressive, which is the same as the red code. Square pixels 1.0 is pretty standard for almost anything you're shooting these days. Earlier on they had things with like DV and DV-NTSC and things like HDV that had different aspect ratios to fit more information on a tape. So you want square pixels pretty much all the time with today's codecs. So we move down. If you're in America, you're going to be using NTSC. If you're in Europe or other places, you'll have PAL. Right now we're on NTSC, and that's checkmark to match. Profile. These are levels of compression as well. If you need to have this thing go above 50 megabits per second, you're going to have to change the level. And high profile, this is always just going to be high profile. It's going to do a higher quality encode. But 4.2, as you move it up to 5.0, 5.1, 5.2, it's going to be higher level encodes with more color depth, and you're going to be able to turn the target bitrate up higher. For YouTube, 4.2 usually does just fine. It has a lot of information. And render at max depth. As we move down here, let's go to bitrate settings and talk about that. Bitrate settings is basically how much information, how much color information it's leaving in this image right here. And look at this shot. This shot is kind of very orange and warmish, so this doesn't have a lot of blues in it. So we can actually take the compression down to around 16 from about 150, which it originally started at, and this image is going to look actually quite nice. But when you're going to YouTube, I really recommend that you can take this up to about, if you've got a good internet signal and you're able to upload quickly and you're kind of patient, I'd say take this up around like 25 megabits per second. It'll be a better quality because what YouTube does is it actually recompresses the file that you've already compressed. So you want to have a nice high quality file to start with when you send it to YouTube, or you'll get some ugly compression artifacts. So your data rate here, your bit rate, is basically how much information it's sending out, how much your computer is sending out per second. And if this gets too high, your computer's not going to understand, or your computer's not going to be able to keep up with it either. So what we're going to do here, and pull this down, and under bit rate encoding, it has three different types. It has what's called a constant bit rate, it has a variable bit rate, 1 pass, and a variable bit rate, 2 pass. What a constant bit rate does is it will keep this bitrate at a constant of whatever megabits per second you set. What variable bitrate will do, and this is usually good if you're doing a higher bitrate. If you're doing something like 25 or above, you put 25 in there, constant bitrate does pretty well. Always the best one to use is going to be variable bitrate, either 1 or 2 pass, but it's going to take more time. Variable bitrate will take more time encoding. What it does is it changes the bitrate as it needs, as it moves through the shot. If the shot becomes more dynamic in color changes and more dynamic in movement, it'll increase the bitrate. And what this does is it'll keep the file size down a bit more. Your file sizes will be lower and your image will be essentially about the same or better than the constant bit rate. So you could take your maximum bit rate up to, let's say, like 35. So if it needs to, it can bring up the quality during the dynamic parts when there's a lot of dynamic changes, and it will bring it down to 25 when it doesn't need to be that high. And you'll get a very good looking image, but it will take longer to encode. Variable bitrate 2 pass, what that will do is it will pass through the video one time, measure all the moments where there are dynamic changes, and it will add keyframes, and it will go back into another encode. This takes about twice as long as the single pass. But this is where you end up with the smallest file and the best looking quality image possible, is by using the variable bitrate 2 pass. So if you've got the time, I'd say always use variable bitrate 2 pass. And if you're going to YouTube, I really recommend doing about 25 megabits per second on your minimum target bit rate and about 35 on your maximum. If you're doing something for broadcast, you might have different specifications and they'll tell you what bitrate they want. If you're doing a master file that you're going to be keeping and using for movies later and using for encodes later on for film festivals and whatnot, I'd really recommend to take this up to about like 40 megabits as your minimum and about 50 megabits as your maximum there, and do a 2 pass. That's if you're mastering your video file to H.264. This is a good way to go. So right now, but look at every time we change this, notice how the file size changes. If we change this to 25 and 35, notice our file size went down from around 500 to about 330. But with a variable bitrate 2 pass, this is going to look really good for YouTube. And one other important thing here is also the audio. And this is very similar with audio. You have different styles of codecs here. You have AAC, Dolby Digital, and MPEG. All three of these are pretty good. Dolby Digital is a pretty standard. AAC is pretty standard as well. MPEG is a little less used, but these two are pretty standard right here. So AAC does pretty good encoding. You don't have to worry as much about audio because the file size is going to be fairly insignificant compared to the size of the video. Video takes a lot more compression data than does audio. So AAC is pretty good, and 48,000 hertz is a really good encode for YouTube or almost anything else that you're using. If you want to maintain that, you're going to have to change your timeline. You're going to have to change your timeline to at least 96,000 hertz, and you can change the sample rate as well. But down here you have bitrate settings. You can pump up. Notice it is at the highest quality setting here at 320. So the bitrate settings work pretty well for kilobits per second. I notice it will affect the size of the file way less. Watch this if I take this down to 16. Look at the size of the file. It only knocked off like 4 megabytes. So that's virtually insignificant compared to the size of the video. So you can afford to keep that up around like 320. If you're encoding MP3s and you're doing like voice MP3s, you might want to do about 120 kilobits per second, but 320 is really good on this, and it's high video quality, high audio quality, so we're pretty well set on audio. Down here, if you're exporting out things like surround sound, you can choose to do either mono, stereo, or 5.1 surround sound. Mono is very rarely used. Stereo is pretty much the standard for YouTube and most televisions. 5.1 is if you have a surround sound setup and you have a surround sound mix, which we don't on this file. Okay, so once we've got those settings done, so we've got H.264, we've customized this, we've kept it at 1920 by 1080, and if you want to, you can actually do the same resolution. You can do a 4K resolution for YouTube because YouTube now supports that. You can do frame rate 23.976. So this is matched, square pixels, everything is all set. Let's go up to our output name. You're going to click on, so once you do H.264 in a YouTube setting and change your megabits per second, you're going to click on output name. Output name will ask you what you want to name your file and where you want to save it. So if I go to my desktop and I name this the wallet YouTube 1920, or we can say 1080p. 1080p, so we know what settings we're using there. And we hit save. That will save it to the desktop and we'll save it under this name. And you got two options down here. You can simply hit export and this will immediately start exporting it directly out of Premiere. This is where I want to bring up the other option. You can also send this to Media Encoder. Media Encoder has a lot of the same settings. I'm not going to go into detailed settings on Media Encoder, but you simply press Q and it will send this to Media Encoder. It'll open up Media Encoder and add this to the queue to do the compression. After a few seconds, Media Encoder opens up and you notice that it has sent over the general codec, the custom file, the custom settings that we've sent over from Premiere, and the location and the name of the file. And now all you have to do, one thing you might want to notice here that will make things happen a lot quicker is if you have a good video card that Media Encoder is recognizing, you can pull this down and tell it to use. Down here it has a couple options, and actually I'm on a Mac, so it's got 3 options. On Mac I've got the CUDA options, which accesses the video card, the GPU, the graphics processor, and up here you've got OpenCL. These are 2 different types. Quite honestly, I don't know which is better. I've always used CUDA and it works just fine. OpenCL works pretty well. So while these 2 are going to be a lot faster than just using software only. If you use software only, if your video card isn't supported, you'll have to do software only. These ones will be grayed out and you'll be forced to do software only. But I would make sure that this is check marked if you have that option. So if you need to do any final changes, you can click on either the H.264, which brings up the general options here. It brings up this window and you can change your format or you can change your custom settings as we had before. If you click on custom, it brings up basically the same window, or you can arrow down and choose a general codec, or click on this arrow down and click a general preset. And then you can click on this and change the name and location if you wish, but these are all set, so all I have to do now is hit play. It's going to render my audio, prepare it for exporting, and once that's done, you'll see it start exporting the video. So now this frees up Premiere. If I want to go into a different timeline now, open up a different timeline, now I can start editing on a different timeline. And like I said, depending on the speed of the computer, this might slow things down in Premiere while Media Encoder is running in the background. But it does open it up so you can keep using Premiere. And actually, if you have different things you want to send over to Media Encoder, now I can hit Command M or Control M on a PC, choose my settings, and this is super slow right now because I've got my screen recorder and my and Media Encoder going and everything going at the same time. I can choose YouTube 1080p and I can hit Q if I have my settings right. Hit Q and I go back to Media Encoder, and after a minute in Media Encoder you'll see that added as well. So now you can keep adding things to Media Encoder as you go back and forth between the software. When it's finished encoding this top one here, it'll automatically start encoding the next one and the next one and the next one. So this is kind of nice to do batch exporting while you're still working. If you have a bunch of different timelines, you can keep sending them to Media Encoder. If you have just one and you're finished editing, it might be just best just to do a direct export directly out of Premiere. Okay, once our file is done here, we can go look at it. Let's close out our programs here. Close Media Encoder. I'm going to close Premiere. Save my settings, sure. And finally, let's take a look at our file here. I'm going to highlight this file here that we've exported. I'm going to hit Command-I for information, or on a PC you right-click on it and go to Properties, and it will show how large this file is. This is 351 megabytes. Originally, it predicted that I would have Premiere, and Media Encoder predicted that this would be around 345. That's pretty good. So this probably had a bit more dynamic movement than it anticipated, so it's a little bit higher than by 5 megabits, which isn't much. But let's take a look at the visual quality here. Let's open it. I like using VLC. It's a free download. Make sure if you download it from Videoland's website instead of from other websites where people can package kind of viruses and other crappy things inside of it, because it's open source. So make sure that you download it from Videoland. I think it's .org. You'll have to Google it. Let's play through this and look at the quality here. 1920 by 1080. Looks really good. I see some noise in here because I intentionally added noise, some grain, to make it look kind of grainy like film. But the compression looks really good when you're looking around people's corners, the heads and whatnot, and this looks really, really nice. Doesn't look like there's much artifacting at all. So there's really nice high